It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting just by emailing me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. That's the best way to get a hold of me. Our guest today is Dr. Stephen Zunes, and you can find him at stephenzunes.org. Stephen is spelled with PH. You can also find him on Twitter at szunes. He does a lot of writing on the Progressive and Truth Out. So you can find him there. He's got about 6 or 7 books up here on Amazon. The newest one is Western Sahara, War, Nationalism, and Conflict, a Resolution, 2nd edition. But a lot of good stuff here that I know the audience would like Tinderbox, U.S. Foreign Policy, and the Roots of Terrorism, Civil Resistance Against Coups, a Comparative and Historical Perspective, Nonviolent Social Movements, a Geographical Perspective. Great stuff from Dr. Stephen Zunes. Dr. Zunes, are you there?
Sure am. Good to be with you.
Thank you so much. Listen, before we get into this article that I found you in Covert Action about Mr. Menendez here, Robert Menendez, tell us about yourself. Who is Dr. Stephen Zunes?
Well, I'm a professor of politics at the University of San Francisco. I've been there for nearly 30 years now. I also am the founding director and once again, current director of the Middle Eastern Studies program there. And I just returned from a sabbatical, 6 months as the Torgny Segerstedt visiting professor at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden.
How was Sweden then? How'd you like it?
It was pretty nice. I mean, I really... there's something to say for social democracy, frankly. When people don't have to worry about health care bills or student loans. They got their problems too, but at least you don't have the obscene inequality you often see in this country, and you know that the waiter, the cab driver, folks like that, they're getting their basic needs met, and you don't even have to tip.
That's right, no tipping over there. So then how do you feel when you come back and you see this slavery we're living over here?
Oh yeah, I mean it's hard in a lot of ways. I mean, there's so much I love about the United States, particularly the beautiful area I live in on the Central California coast. But it is rather shocking, especially to see the rise of the far right here. I mean, some of that's going on in Europe as well, of course, not less so in Sweden, but. It is rather disturbing, actually, and of course, being a political scientist, I can't turn away from it. I have to look at it, I have to study it, I have to read the news, and that's sometimes difficult.
Okay, 2 more quick questions before we get into Robert Menendez. When you're over there in Sweden, the average person, do they seem happier? Yes,
they do, and many studies by social psychologists and others. Uphold that, and they're an increasingly diverse society, and that's cool with most people. I mean, you do have some anti-immigrant backlash, like you do in most places, but people are mostly cool about that. And there does tend to be a sense that people look out for you. People complain about bureaucratic government like they do everywhere else, but there is also a sense that it's not a wrong thing for the government to look after the social welfare of people. For example, you get 480 paid leave days, 480 days of paid leave when you become a new parent. You birth a child or adoption, and once that's over, you get free child care. And the child care the ratio is like 5 to 1 adults to children, and half of them seem to have degrees in early childhood education. And so, you get a good start there. and I think it reflects in the fact that they have such a very, very low crime rate and a high degree of social cohesion.
Okay, it's already becoming a depressing show. We gotta consider the conditions we're living in over here, and possibly about to get really worse, man. Okay, so I found you in Covert Action magazine. You wrote this article called "Indictment Against Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chair Offers Window into Corruption Underlying U.S. Foreign Policy." And this is the case against Robert Menendez, who's the Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chair. So how do you want to get started on this? Explain to the audience.
Well, a couple things. And one is this is not his first indictment. He was indicted back in 2015 for bribery and corruption, but there was a hung jury and a mistrial. And despite that, the Democrats named him to be the chair of the committee. And for those who've been following the trial, the verdict may or may not have come out by the time listeners are hearing this. That it was pretty jaw-dropping in terms of we're talking about $480,000 of cash hidden in his home, additional $70,000 in a safety deposit box, gold bars, a Mercedes convertible in the garage, mortgage payments in a house. I mean, it was really, and all apparently in the influence, trying to use his position to influence U.S. policy to support the brutal dictatorial regime of Egypt. But what's what kind of underscores this is that there has been a tendency in the Democratic Party to at least in recent years, to have people in these foreign policy positions that take pretty hard-line positions, hawkish positions on things like military spending, on support for the Israeli and Moroccan occupations, and for support for dictatorships like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and UAE and Oman and the like. And Bahrain, you could go down the list. But again, the idea that the other thing that comes out of this is, Menendez is getting his trial, that it hasn't seemed to have harmed U.S. relations with Egypt. I mean, this was done on behalf of the government in Egypt. There's very strong evidence the government of Egypt was very much behind that, and one would think that if a foreign government was trying to influence U.S. policy by bribing a powerful senator as head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that might be a crisis and lead to a crisis in relations. It might lead Washington to say to the Egyptians, if you're going to do this to us, we're going to stop propping up your regime. But apparently it hasn't hurt U.S. relations at all. Congress and President Biden seem fine about continuing to send them more than $1.3 billion in annual military aid to the regime, despite its massacre of thousands of protesters, its imprisonment of 60,000 dissidents, and widespread use of torture and rampant corruption. I mean, Egypt's the third highest recipient of U.S. military aid, with only Ukraine and Israel receiving more taxpayer dollars.
And you're the director of the program Middle Eastern Studies, right? So that is in their culture over there for bribery, for these kind of government transactions, right?
I mean, not necessarily. I mean, they are. Indeed, part of the so-called Arab Spring, the massive protests there. There was not just democracy for its own right, but belief in democracy because that's the best way to hold governments accountable, including for things like corruption. So yes, corruption is widespread in that part of the world because they are authoritarian regimes and they think they can get away with it. But it's not cultural in the sense that most people accept it. It's not cultural in the sense that most people like it. And indeed, it has been a motivator for quite a bit of protest. Indeed, a fair amount of people that are in prisons in places like Egypt are doing so because they blew the whistle on corruption.
Now, has this been reported widely in the mainstream media, the Egyptian connection to all this? Because I didn't notice it until I read your article.
Yeah, not much, and there is this tendency, and we found this in the for many years, going back, remember during the Reagan era and even before, throughout the Cold War and subsequently, there is a tendency in our mainstream media to, following the lead of the U.S. government, to publicize and sometimes even exaggerate human rights abuses by governments the United States doesn't like, but downplay or ignore or rationalize for human rights abuses by governments allied with the United States. I mean, 57% of the world's dictatorships get arms from the United States, and yet we see time and time again, that the key to U.S. foreign policy is to promote democracy and to defend human rights. And and Biden is repeatedly, praised for his defense of these principles. But with him, with George W. Bush, with Ronald Reagan, those who really tried to, put forward this idea, hey, we're here about defend freedom, it tends to mostly be freedom from people who are oppressed by governments, like Russia, like Syria, like Iran, like Burma. And again, we should defend freedom there. I'm not objecting to standing up for freedom and challenging these oppressive regimes. But we really, it's wrong, I think, both on a moral level, but also in terms of our credibility internationally. If we then turn around and give a free pass to autocratic regimes like Egypt, that have these terrible human rights records. I mean, Menendez, attacked Obama, for his trying to normalize relations with Cuba, saying Cuba is a totalitarian regime. He was one of only two senators to vote against the Iran nuclear deal because we shouldn't be having arms control agreements with these totalitarian regimes, and yet again he's on the payroll of Egypt, which is one of the worst human rights abusers in the world, and again it in many ways is a reflection of this long-standing tendency of the United States to support human rights not as a universal principle as it should be, but essentially a political tool to go after governments we don't like, and something we set aside if the violations are by governments that are considered allies.
Okay, so how does that work then? We have the Democrats and the Republicans with social issues. Okay, fine, one is more liberal than the other, but foreign policy never changes, right? Then who is?
Yeah, there are some remarkable similarities in many respects. Yeah. I mean, of course, with Trump, we have a new wild card where he's actually defending the likes of Putin and Orban and some of these folks that at least the Democrats have the decency to oppose, but. And the Democrats and Republicans in general have tended to be a little hawkish, more hawkish than Democrats, and generally less concerned about human rights. I mean, people, Carter, even Jimmy Carter, wasn't as consistent as he should have been on human rights, but he was in many ways a breath of fresh air from the realpolitik of Nixon and Kissinger, and similarly, Obama. Was more concerned about these issues than George W. Bush, despite his pro-democracy rhetoric. But the thing is that, in general, yes, there is a tendency within the foreign policy establishment, what some people have referred to as the blob, and that is this very, very powerful collection of forces in the establishment that really, see the world in these very in these somewhat traditional views of power politics, and where ethical principles take a back seat. Now, but this is very, very different than American public opinion. I mean, there's probably no issue in American politics where there's such a huge gap between public opinion and public policy than the question of U.S. support for dictatorial regimes and occupation armies. And a lot of the criticism of U.S. Of Biden's support for Israel's war in Gaza is not just from the hardcore pro-Palestinian anti-Zionist crowd, but from a lot of mainstream liberals who say, it was wrong when Reagan was supporting the Salvadoran government, a far-right regime engaging in these incredible war crimes, killing tens of thousands of people. It's wrong when we do it with Netanyahu in Israel as well. But we see and a lot of people, especially older people of my generation and older, who actually remember the likes of Eleanor Roosevelt and Adlai Stevenson, the people who helped form the post-World War II liberal international order, around human rights, around international law, and to see a Democratic president dissing the International Criminal Court, dissing the International Court of Justice, attacking Amnesty International and groups like that because they dare criticize not just Hamas, not just Iran, not just Russia and Syria and Burma and other regimes, but they're willing to criticize U.S. allies like Israel as well.
Yeah, it really is. But wait a minute. You said your age. You look like a young man in your picture. How old are you?
I'm 67.
Oh, 67. Really? You look great, man. I'd say I'm 62. I'm falling apart, bro. You look great. Well, now, when you mention these interests, listen, there's money to be made in carpet bombing Gaza, right? So the interest, wouldn't it be the oil industry and the arms industry? And
certainly.
banking?
I mean, the arms industry is really huge in terms of pushing for these lucrative arms sales, to regimes like Saudi Arabia and UAE and others who can pay in cash. I mean, it's funny, we talk about the supposed threat from Iran, but Saudi Arabia and UAE have collectively have military budgets over 10 times bigger than Iran. It's not like they need the U.S. to protect them. But yeah, these are hugely profitable. And even we talk about U.S. aid to Israel, and some people are saying, that if it's billions of dollars, it comes out to $500, $800, however you want to measure it, to every Israeli man, woman, and child. But Israelis don't see that money. Yeah. 80% of U.S. aid to Israel are basically subsidies to U.S. arms manufacturers to send that then are sent to sent to Israel. I mean, the arms industry has a bigger lobbying budget than AIPAC does. So, yeah, this is a huge factor. And again, I started off, comparing the Sweden and the United States. One reason that Sweden can afford all these things is that they don't have such a huge military budget, even though it's growing in response to some legitimate concerns about Russia. Nowhere close as high as the United States, and so yeah, I would say that the arms industry is a major a factor in this continuing insistence that the U.S. Arm these dictatorial regimes either through foreign military sales or, as in the case of Egypt and Israel, through taxpayer funded grants.
And does Sweden have a nationalized oil industry?
No, they have. They don't have their own oil. They don't have their own oil.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
But they have actually privatized a fair amount of things in recent years. Some of it's made things work more efficiently. Some areas that it's actually made things worse, which is often the case when you go in that direction. It's a mixed bag, but they've been done a great job at reducing energy consumption. I mean, it's a much colder climate from the United States, but they use about half the energy Americans do per capita because of certain ways of zoning and construction in terms of encouraging electrical vehicles and other measures.
Yeah, and to back up a bit to this foreign aid, I want the audience to really, really understand this because we got an expert on the show here, Dr. Stephen Zunes. Okay, professor, okay, author of all these books, international expert. This foreign aid that people get so upset about thinking that we give away money to all these other countries, it never goes to other countries. There are lobbyists in this country that get contracts for foreign aid, like military, but also medical equipment, all that kind of crap too, bridging equipment, the rebuilding, earthquake areas. None of that money is being given away to another country. All that money goes back into pockets of the rich here in this country. Am I correct, Dr. Stevens?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends. It depends. There's certainly programs that do seem to benefit corporate interest more than others. But there are some genuine programs that are grassroots oriented that do end up helping ordinary people. It's you need to look at them program by program. I mean, Egypt's interesting. I mean, even the foreign aid we give to Egypt is not most of the foreign aid we give to Egypt is military, but a lot of foreign aid that we do go. Let's say we provide some surplus wheat to them. You'll have incidents where there'll be corrupt government officials who will take the wheat and sell it to affluent Egyptians who can buy it instead of distributing it to the poor, and ends up flooding the market and actually hurting domestic wheat production. So sometimes you do have situations where you end up causing more hunger than you than you reduce. But there are indeed some legitimate programs that do generally go to the people. They have help prevent disease, help prevent starvation, help to engage in more grassroots sustainable development. So it's a mixed bag.
Now back again to the former Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Robert Menendez. You described how it's the typical old method of accepting bribes where, you take out a mortgage on your house or you purchase a car, then someone else is making those car payments, someone else is making those house payments to launder that money into you, right? Now, and we see, he's got tons of cash sitting around too as well. But now, there's allegations, one is like a meat company and another one is the Egyptians, right?
Yeah. Maybe these are Egyptian-based companies. If you're a successful business in Egypt, you got ties with the regime. It's a classic case of crony capitalism.
But now there's another entity that has an interest in this too, and that's the arms dealers that are going to get these contracts. Is there any indication, because there's no investigation of it, but maybe Dr. Zunes looked into it, is there any indication he received some money from the arms industry, even over the table or under the table?
Not illegally. But these arms industries certainly have their political action committees that certainly donate to the campaigns of officials who are in powerful positions that control the allocation of funds, either for domestic military production or for foreign military assistance.
Right out in the open. Yeah,
that's legal.
That's business as usual. And it even got worse, too. There was just a Supreme Court ruling said that these politicians can take gratuities, they called it.
Exactly. No, it's obscene. It really is. And I think that this whole question of the power of what some people have long referred to as a military-industrial complex is something that's very real. I mean, Eisenhower himself warned us of its power, and he basically said every missile fired, every warship launched, every bomber produced is a theft from those who need food, those who need shelter. And it's obscene that a country as wealthy as ours, has such poverty, has such inequality, has such crushing student debt, isn't putting more resources into fighting climate change. But a major reason is the military-industrial complex. And it's even worse when many of these weapons are used not for the legitimate defense of the United States or the legitimate defense of democratic allies which are threatened, but brutal dictatorial regimes, like that of Egypt, and occupying armies such as Israel and Morocco, and governments like Saudi Arabia very recently, and Egypt and Israel today, which are using these weapons in the commission of war crimes.
Ironic that they call it a defense budget when we're on the offense everywhere. Where are we on the defense?
Exactly. I think only by most estimates, only about 20% of the Pentagon budget goes for genuine defense.
It's just you got to laugh, man. I was going to start crying. Now back to Menendez, though, right? This guy's had some ride his whole career. Very corrupt guy. I mean, first it comes out, Cuban parents. I'm Cuban myself, but there's a lot of intelligence community around the Cuban community, Cuban exile community. Then he's got these other charges, like you said, that they were hung jury. The case is dismissed. That was a bribery case too. But he seems and the allegations down in the Dominican Republic that he's down there paying young girls for sex, prostitution. What is it? What kind of protection does this guy have? Intelligence?
New Jersey politics has been long known for being fairly corrupt, a kind of machine, politics, kind of thing. And people like that have risen in prominence. Both Democrats like Menendez, Republicans like Chris Christie. It's not that unusual. But what's disturbing about this is that he has seems to be given a pass by the Democratic leadership, that they were willing to have a guy like this in such an influential position as the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, even though he, despite his efforts to undermine some of Obama's important foreign policy initiatives, even though he sided with the Republicans on a lot of issues, and even though he's been well to the right of most Democrats. I mean, historically, the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, at least when it's been the home of Democrats, and we think of Claiborne Pell, we think of Frank Church, we think of William Fulbright, they were the ones that would pressure presidents, including Democratic presidents, to say, hey, maybe this military intervention is wrong. Maybe we shouldn't be supporting these dictatorships. Maybe we should rely more on diplomacy and threats. In other words, they were taking seriously Congress's role in terms of checks and balances to challenge abuses of presidential power that could get us into trouble, like Vietnam, like Central America, like Iraq. But Menendez is just the opposite. I mean, he's pushing presidents to the right and to be more militaristic, more interventionist, less willing to engage in diplomacy, and turning the whole role of Congress on these kinds of issues on its head. And yes, the president is primarily in charge of foreign policy. It's primarily an executive thing, but we need a Congress, that is willing to say, "Hey, wait a minute," if there's concern that things are going in the wrong direction.
And it would seem that too, with this latest Supreme Court ruling over the immunity for official acts. What would stop a president from supporting war crimes over in Gaza right now? There's nothing to prevent that now, is there?
Yeah, well, actually, what's scary about the ruling, of course, is that it makes it more very, very difficult to hold a president accountable for breaking U.S. law. But presidents have long gotten away with getting rid of international law. I mean, look at Reagan in the support of the Contras. The International Court of Justice unanimously, save the U.S. judge, said that who dissented largely on the technicality, said, hey, we can't attack a sovereign country like that and raise a mercenary army of terrorists and blockade and mine the harbors and bomb the oil installations. That's a war crime. And Biden and Reagan essentially said, "Screw you," And when similarly when the International Court of Justice, basically said, well, Israel could build a separation barrier along its border, protect it from terrorist attacks. They couldn't build it in a serpentine fashion to incorporate all these illegal, settlements and make it impossible for Palestinians to go from one town to another. Again, unanimous say for the U.S. judge, and he was, and the Bush attacked not only did Bush attack the Supreme Court, but the International Court of Justice, but Menendez attacked it. John Kerry attacked it, who was then the Democratic nominee for president, and the vast majority of Democrats joined in. That there is this kind of sense that international law is something that can be ignored if a U.S. ally is involved, and we've seen other. I mean, when the team of these high-powered British jurists, who've been involved in war crimes issues in former Yugoslavia and in Sudan and in Syria and elsewhere, these great pedigrees, saying that there's considerable evidence that 3 Hamas leaders and 2 Israeli leaders are guilty of war crimes violations, including crimes against humanity, and they were blasted by Biden and congressional leaders of both parties without apparently even reading the charges. I mean, for example, Biden said they're treating them as equivalent, Hamas and Israel as equivalent. They didn't. These were specific charges against specific people that were separate, and they're actually the more serious charges were against Hamas. But he basically misrepresented what was actually coming down there, and similarly claiming back when he was a senator that the International Court of Justice had opposed Israel's right to self-defense and saying they couldn't build a separation barrier. Again, you could build a wall, a fence, a moat, whatever you want on your border. That's legal. You just can't use it as part of a land grab. So again, this hostility towards international law and the U.S. being willing to violate it itself, in the case of Nicaragua, but to facilitate allies. Another example is Morocco. Morocco, again, going against the UN Security Council, the International Court of Justice, and others, illegally invaded and annexed Western Sahara, the country immediately to its south. Western Sahara is a full member state of the African Union. It declared its independence from Spain back in 1976. When Trump ended up recognizing Morocco's illegal annexation, becoming the first and only country to do so, and when Biden came in, he refused to reverse it. I mean, if you look at National Geographic, Rand McNally, Google, Apple Maps, any of the regular maps, you'll see Western Sahara as either a separate country or maybe with hash marks or something demarcating it as an occupied territory or not totally part of Morocco. U.S. government maps, from the State Department to NASA, one country. No difference, no demarcation. And this is a problem, not just because the people of Western Sahara are being oppressed. I mean, Freedom House ranks it second only to Syria in terms of the denial of political rights. But when Biden stands up and says correctly that in reference to Russia, no country can unilaterally change international boundaries, no country can expand its territory by force, people say, well, that's true. Why do you recognize what Morocco did? Similarly, the U.S. is the only country to recognize Israel's illegal annexation of the Golan region from Syria. And yeah, I can understand why people might want to turn it back over to Syria, but to immediately, given the situation there, but to say that it is part of Israel and Israel can annex it when it seized it by force in 1967. Just 8 years before Morocco seized Western Sahara. Again, international law is like domestic law. In domestic law, someone couldn't get away with only indicting Republicans and not Democrats, or only indicting Democrats and not Republicans. Yet in international law, the U.S. policy seems to be, let's see what this country's relations is with the United States, then we'll decide if it's legitimate or not. In fact, Congress, the House of Representatives, passed a bill mostly almost with virtually all Republicans, but several dozen Democrats as well, putting sanctions on anybody associated with the International Criminal Court if they indict any individuals that are from a country allied with the United States. And they specifically say allied with the United States. They're not being subtle. They don't care what the evidence is. They just care about the war criminals' relations with the United States.
Right in your face, man. Like right in our faces. And now I'm assuming a lot of this stuff you're talking about right now about Morocco, this is in your latest book, Western Sahara, War, Nationalism, and Conflict Irresolution? Yes,
it is. It is the other occupation that a lot of people don't know about. And it's ironic because, unlike the Palestinians, the Western Saharans are united under one nationalist group, the Polisario Front, which is their recognized government. They've never engaged in terrorism. They've never questioned Morocco's right to exist, and they have democratic elections. For the people in the refugee camps where the Polisario runs things, and in the small section of the territory that they control that's not under Moroccan occupation. They're actually pretty democratic on top of that. And they support equal rights for women. I mean, it's quite striking that here you have an Arab Muslim government that is supposedly doing the things doing the things that we supposedly think an Arab Muslim government should do in terms of abiding by international law and democracy, women's rights, and that kind of thing. And yet we're supporting this authoritarian monarchy occupying the country and claim that they have no right to exist. And it also sort of sends a message to the Palestinians. Look, even if you get your act together and stop terrorism, become democratic, become unified, and all the factions recognize Israel, we won't necessarily support you anyway because, look, we don't support the Western Saharans when they've already done those things. So, yeah, it's yet another example of when U.S. has its double standard on international law. It's not only wrong, in terms of the people who are suffering as a result, but it also really harms U.S. credibility and our diplomacy when we do want to do the right thing when it comes to human rights and international law.
And what's the motivation? And because we have good trade relations with these countries, and that's why we prop up these dictators?
Yeah. I mean, it's the old thing that we've seen. We've seen since the time of the Cold War, and even before. We think of one former president's comments about the notorious dictator Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua. He's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. That is, this idea that things like close strategic and economic relations are more important than the values that we profess to uphold. But these things have a tendency to blow up in our faces. I remember being in college in the 1970s, and I was part of the local Amnesty International chapter, and a lot of people were concerned about human rights. Were very disturbed about the Shah of Iran and the incredible repression, the torture, the disappearances, and this was done with tens of thousands of U.S. advisors and military trainers and all sorts of things. And we were saying, this is terrible, not just for the people of Iran, but this could lead to an anti-American reaction. And sure enough, when people got tired of their oppression, they did rise up, and we had the Iranian Revolution. And the Shah had been so successful at wiping out the liberal, leftist, nationalist, secular opposition. The one area where he couldn't totally penetrate and control were the mosques. And so when they had the revolution, guess who came to the fore to be in charge? It was the reactionary clerics who inherited these, in today's dollars, hundreds of billions worth of sophisticated U.S. arms. And we see this, and we've had this a new and by some measures even worse dictatorship in charge ever since, and one that very much threatens American and other interests in the region. So again, this idea that somehow we can continue this contradiction of supporting dictatorial regimes, supporting war crimes, supporting violations of international law, and our narrowly defined self-interest, ignores the fact that people react to that. Because I remember when George W. Bush was saying, why do they hate us? They hate our freedom. They hate our freedoms. They hate our democracy, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I've been to almost every Middle Eastern country, and I can tell you that as proud as I am of America's individual liberties and our democratic rights, most people in the Middle East don't see that. They see "Made in USA" on tear gas canisters and bomb casings, and that is where the anti-Americanism comes from. It's not because of our values. It's when we stray from those values and support these dictatorships and occupation army.
Yeah, I remember that night when David Letterman asked Dan Rather right after 9/11, why do they hate us? Like, even he doesn't know? It's just... I guess the average person is just not paying attention. couple of questions for you. Oh, okay. I was getting back to Menendez for a second here, because I was brushing up on this, and I noticed that he was, for Hillary Clinton, he was given a position of national campaign co-chair. And I almost thought that, hey, maybe I misread that or I misunderstood that. But this guy was the co-chair of Hillary Clinton's campaign. Now, why was that? Because of their mutual foreign policy? They agreed on their foreign...
Well, they both have a pretty hawkish foreign policy. Yeah. But I think more of the fact that he is very experienced machine politician. See, he knows how to get out the votes. He knows how to work the the mechanics of an election. And he was a senior member in Congress. Now, I'm not sure. I mean, many of these titles are more honorific than anything else. I'm not sure how directly involved he was in the campaign. But it is rather surprising because the thing is, people I know in New Jersey and the Democratic Party there, I mean, they've known this guy has been corrupt from the very beginning. I mean, and yeah, I mean, some of them were surprised at just how flagrant this current round is. But yeah, it is rather disturbing that so many people, including Hillary Clinton, including Chuck Schumer, and including other Democratic leaders, have been so willing to give this guy a pass all this time. But one thing I do want to credit the Democrats for, however, is that unlike the Republicans, they're not screaming that this is a political witch hunt. They're not screaming that the court system and everything else is biased. They're not screaming that it's some sinister conspiracy by the other party or anything like that. The vast majority of Democrats are trusting the judicial process and are not denying the seriousness of these charges.
I got to tell you, Dr. Zunes, just give it time, okay? Because I think everyone who's paying attention to politics sees that this con man, this guy's con works. You just keep repeating those lines over and over again, and the average guy just falls for it, just believes anything. So sooner or later, the Democrats are going to catch on to that one, too. Boy. I wanted to ask you back to, because when you mentioned Viktor Orban, right? Mm-hmm. The Hungarian president, right? Or dictator over there. Now, he just had a meeting with South Korea, and he had, or was it the chief from China, and then Putin, and then came down and met in person with Trump. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, he is part of this a new authoritarianism, the strong kind of right-wing nationalist perspective that is racist, in some cases anti-Semitic, that very much anti-immigrant, strongly socially conservative in terms of opposition to LGBTQ rights. He advocating in what he calls an illiberal democracy. That is one that may have the trappings of democracy in terms of elections or whatever, but the values are very are ultra conservative. And the elections really aren't that free and fair either, because basically when he was elected, initially democratically, he ended up doing what Trump is planning to do with this Project 2025. That is to basically take control of the courts, not just with conservative jurists, but far right, really extremist people that are loyal to him, to fire thousands and thousands and thousands of civil servants, career people, and government agencies, and replace them with loyalists. Basically, and the independents, therefore, the FBI, the Justice Department, and the like, and suppress the media, so that the pro government, pro Trump in this case, media dominates the airwaves and other communications, and essentially impose an authoritarian system. And this is why, despite the fact that I've gotten a reputation of being one of Biden's biggest critics, because it is foreign policy. My focus is foreign policy, particularly Middle Eastern foreign policy, so I have good reason to be upset at Biden on a number of things. But at the same time, I as disappointed as I am at Biden and many Democratic leaders' support for authoritarianism and disrespect for international law abroad, at least they respect the rule of law at home. And at least they support democracy at home, and that's quite critical. The problem, though, is that as someone who works with young people, as a father of young adults, and knowing them and their friends and my students and things like that, is that Bush's support for the Gaza war is alienating them on a degree we haven't seen since Vietnam. And so when and the polls show that Biden's support among youth, along with Arab Americans, among the Muslims, among with the progressives, has plummeted. And no, very few of these people are going to vote for Trump, but they might vote for the Green Party or Cornel West or some minor party candidate, or they won't vote at all. Or if they do vote, they're not going to go out and do the door-to-door campaigning and all that, that army of volunteers that Democrats have to rely on to get out the vote. And so we're seeing, in many ways, we are seeing a repeat of 1968, alienating key constituencies on an area of war and peace, on a war they see as fundamentally immoral, that the U.S. is responsible for the deaths of thousands of children and all that kind of thing, but also that their protests, which have been 97% peaceful, are being depicted as their most extreme violent element and brutally and violently suppressed. And on top of that, there's a convention in Chicago. So, it could be 1968 over again, where the Democrats' insistence in supporting a pro-Vietnam War president at a time when most people were opposed to the war, and young people in particular found it as a moral outrage. We're seeing a similar scenario today, at least if Biden gets renominated.
Oh, yeah. These anti-genocide protesters, they're showing up like when Pelosi comes to town or the VP comes to town. They're tipped off in advance. They're showing up. One more thing about Project 2025. You're talking about Trump being allowed to fire, and run the Justice Department like a weapon. The Supreme Court also ruled that his communications with the Justice Department and agencies like that are all private and cannot be shared or even subpoenaed, I believe the ruling said.
Right, it's quite disturbing. This belief in this kind of unitary executive, which is a very extremely radical notion. Nobody really took seriously. The first people who really started advocating it were those under George W. Bush's administration. But even then, it seemed their ability to get away with it was limited by the fact we did have these supposed checks and balances, including the judiciary branch. But the judiciary has essentially been staging a coup, saying that everything from environmental regulations to worker safety and health to student loan forgiveness and whatever else cannot be determined by the president and the agencies that have been empowered to do these sorts of things, but by judges like themselves, a disproportionate number of whom have been appointed by people like Trump and George W. Bush, and neither of whom got the majority of the popular vote in coming to office. So regardless how one feels about these particular issues, we are talking about some genuine threats to democracy, and that's what's really frightening. Because I really do have a lot of faith in the American people, even on foreign policy issues where there's a strong executive role. I've seen how protests and organizing change U.S. policy on Vietnam, on Central America, on Southern Africa, on the arms race, on Iraq, even obscure issues like East Timor, where people supporting human rights, international law, democracy, have ended up shifting U.S. foreign policy. But if we have a government that is not accountable to people, and can control the narrative and can overrule democratically elected people in Congress and even the executive branch, that's a lot more serious, and it really is a move towards authoritarianism. It's not like hyperbole to say that.
No, it's not. It's a perfect storm. We got a Supreme Court stacked, taking private helicopter rides to St. Petersburg, Russia, to some palace over there. Money falling in there, $4 million, and unreported donations and gifts. Just crazy what's going on here. We've been talking to Dr. Stephen Zunes, and that's Stephen with a PH, Zunes, Zunes. You can find him at stephenzunes.org. He's on Twitter at szunes, SZUNES. He writes for The Progressive and Truth Out. Dr. Zunes, what do you want to leave us with? We got about 1 minute left. Something positive.
Yeah, well, I think, I'm as cynical as I am of both political parties, and where I think they have not taken seriously the principles this country supposedly believes in involving human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. I do have faith in the American people. And, part of my research, the hopeful side of my research, is how people have risen up and overthrown dictatorships, largely through massive non-cooperation and civil resistance. And so I think as long as Americans are informed, as long as Americans are engaged, and as long as people are willing to nonviolently put their bodies on the line for these principles, I do think we can weather the storm and come out better at the end. I really do.
And even with the social media manipulation that we have today, and all that, it's such a new ingredient of.
It is, but with social media, it can also be used to share the truth, and I think there's it's a difficult time. Like the Chinese character for crisis. It's a compound word for danger and opportunity, and that's exactly the situation we're in today.
On that note, that's a positive note. I'll take that one, okay? Because I think I'm quite a bit more cynical than you, but I thank you for your expertise. It's brilliant stuff, my friend. Dr. Stephen Zunes, stephenzunes.org. A lot of articles on the Dr. stephenzunes.org. But also check out The Progressive and Truth Out. Check out the Covert Action magazine. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Good night, sir.